is in apartheid states get laundered through the UN Conference on Racism in Durban in South Africa in 2001. Genocide is laundered through the International Court of Justice. Doesn't matter that the International Court of Justice didn't say that Israel's committing genocide. I'm sure you noticed, very few people did, that the president of the court went to give one interview where she mumbled, look, this is not what the court said. But who cares? Because all that matters is genocide, International Court of Justice, prestige, that's it, longer. So this is the playbook. Prestige through international institutions. So-called human rights group with their bizarre reports where they basically quote each other. This whole notion also of quoting each other to create a thick web that appears respectable, but everyone is just quoting each other, is something indeed that the Soviet Union kind of initiated and exported. And of course, academia. All the money that went into academia to create a situation where you will get a PhD for Zionism is colonialism, you'll get tenured for Israel as an apartheid state. This creates prestige, and it launders those libels, those simple messages through those institutions of prestige, thereby creating a 360 environment where the people who try to speak against it are the ones that are deemed absolutely insane. What? You're saying that Harvard and Columbia and the UN and Amnesty are all in this together? You're the ones that sound absolutely insane. So this is the mechanism of mass manipulation that we're living through. Now, after October 7th, what happened is that all that emerged from what I've come to call the metaphorical tunnels. We know about the real tunnels here in Gaza. The metaphorical tunnels are these things that I described that have been dug under the most hallowed and prestigious institutions of the West and the post-World War II order. It's not that something happened on October 7th and then this began to happen. Those tunnels were dug for decades under those institutions, academia, human rights, UN, international bodies. And then on October 7th, people emerged from those metaphorical tunnels. One of my favorite writers, Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, he has a Substack. He's a former Egyptian who writes beautifully on the current moment, de-radicalized himself through the sheer power of thought and human reason. And he described the eruption of euphoric demonstrations in the West on October 7th and 8th as symbolic participation in the pogrom. And I think it's very accurate. They basically wanted to participate. Why? Because what they saw on October 7th, and now I'm going to sound crazy, but I'm going to make my case, what they saw through the GoPro cameras of Hamas streamed live is the birthing of utopia. Why? After October 7th, a new placard appeared. As I said, I follow these, so I noticed, and using environmental language, it said, keep the world clean. Using an image of a Star of David or a flag of Israel in the trash bin. When I saw that, I said, this is it. This is the culmination of all the decades of creating these equations endlessly repeated and laundered through the institutions of prestige. Because if you are constantly exposed, and as I'm sure you know, why is repetition so important? Because our brains are wired not for truth, not for human reason. They're wired to perceive repetition as truth. The more things are repeated, the more our brains perceive them as real. We know that now much more with kind of brain and neuroscience. So if you are subjected to this endless repetition, which is effectively Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil, well, if there is evil, there is only one conclusion. There can be no other. That evil must be eradicated. And this is the notion of keep the world clean. And this is the most dangerous and most ancient idea, certainly when it comes to Jews, but not only. It's the idea that a clean world, a better world, utopia, awaits us on the other side of something. In this case, the eradication of the collective Jew, which has to be placed in the trash bin by any means necessary. I'm sure you've heard that too. And that's what they saw on October 7th. The beginning of the eradication of evil by any means necessary. And when people began to say, how do feminists not care about the women? How do human rights groups don't care about the hostages and all these things? That was a complete failure to understand that if the Jew, the collective Jew, that now goes under the name of Zionist Israel, whatever, if that collective Jew is the obstacle to a better world, then there is no sympathy to that obstacle. That obstacle has to be removed. And this kind of notion that utopia awaits on the other side of an obstacle is always the prelude to atrocities. Because human beings, except for really very few, are not violent psychopaths. Human beings, in order to engage in mass atrocities, have to believe that it is done in the name of birthing utopia, of giving birth to a better world. And why did this all come together? Because as Israel Zionism starved David for decades, through this mechanism of simple messages, strong visual symbols, endlessly repeated, laundered through institutions of prestige, as Israel Zionism starved David was made to stand for the greatest evil, it's not a coincidence that all the good words, justice, equality, freedom, rights, have been placed on its negation, on its erasure, what I've come to call Palestinianism. Palestinianism is the name that I gave to the ideology of millions of people who have organized themselves around the notion that their most noble and important duty is not to create something for themselves, but to undo Jewish sovereignty. And this is the reason why you saw queers for Palestine, feminists for Palestine. Palestine is about fighting capitalism and preventing climate change. And people saw these organizations and these banners, and they laughed, and they were like, oh, these are morons, don't they understand what would happen to homosexuals in Gaza? But that is only a surface understanding of those banners, because underneath is this much more sinister logic that says that Palestine, if ever, but certainly long ago, disconnected from any notion of real people. And it has become the abstract marker of the world without the collective Jew. Therefore, utopia. Palestine, therefore, is the flag and the symbol of everything good. Everything that we want in this world is Palestine, because Palestine is the world without the collective Jew. Literally from the river to the sea means erasure. The word Palestine is a source of erasure. It's all about erasing, eradicating that which stands between the world and utopia. And that is what I believe that we are living through right now. What does it mean? Because I admit it's a very grim analysis. So what does it mean? First of all, I think, yes, we do need to understand that this is a grim analysis. This is what is happening. If you take it to its logical conclusion, it is incredibly dangerous, because once people get it into their minds that this thing stands between them and a better world, then by any means necessary becomes utterly justified. And it is not about Israel, and it is not about this or that government. It is about the means of an assault on Jewish life that is allowed to proceed under the cover of respectability. And another aspect of it is that it is global. I was in Australia in June, visiting the community there. And this was in June, so a few months ago, a few months before the Bondi Beach massacre. And they told me then, the community, they said, look, we in Australia were supposed to be in the place which is as far away from all this insanity as possible. We were supposed to be in the place that just is too far away for any of this to touch us. And they said, but now it's here. And they said it already in June. And they knew it and they felt it. So it's now gone global. And the implications are as follows. First, the Jews need to understand that this is what's going on. Nothing less. It's not something that if the war in Gaza is over, will be over. The war in Gaza was just from their perspective a superb opportunity to accelerate this process. But the process was marching on for decades already. It served as an accelerant. Much of my criticism within Israel to our leadership is that we didn't understand where the war was taking place. If I were to put it in numbers, maybe 30% of the war was in Gaza. 70% was a global war of mass manipulation. And whereas we showed up bravely to the war in Gaza, we were, I would argue, barely to be seen in the war that I think actually matters for the long term. So it means that we need to understand that this is a war that is being waged on Jewish life everywhere. Everywhere is everywhere. In Israel, around the world. We need to understand that when these processes continue to their logical conclusion, the Jews obviously suffer the brunt of the damage. For many years before October 7th, when I would participate in all these debates, is anti-Zionism the new form of anti-Semitism? And I would lose all these debates. They would parade out the anti-Zionist Jew. They'd be like, see, it has nothing to do with Jews. A Jew is sitting here on the podium saying it has nothing to do with Jews. This is, by the way, why anti-Zionist Jews are so valuable. Because they are the cover that allows this assault to proceed and to gain advantage with Jews and their allies being unable to really understand the magnitude of the challenge. Because Jews are saying this, it's not about Jews. No, it's not that other thing. And by the way, when people try to understand why there are anti-Zionist Jews, it's precisely because if you look at the incentive structure, this will always be such that you will have them, because the price for being with your people is constantly raised, and the price of selling, or the reward of selling out your people, is also raised. If you are an anti-Zionist Jew, there are rewards for that. You will be platformed, you will be tenured, you will have your op-eds published in the New York Times. You will get a megaphone, which you would normally not get if it were not for the fact that you're selling out your people. So when you have this incentive structure, and in this point it's very pronounced. When Israel, one of the successes of Zionism is that we're kind of isolated to some degree from the pressures of anti-Semitism, and we don't really get it. And even I, who's been very involved in this world, and speaking with Jewish communities and observing the right of anti-Zionism, even I had this kind of measure of isolation. And there are things in the Jewish condition that I only understood after October 7th. So for example, when you study literature in high school, you learn Metamorphosis by Kafka. And you're thinking, what an odd story. Someone wakes up one day and they're a giant, disgusting insect. Interesting metaphor, you learn the story, whatever, literature class, you move on. On October 7th, I got it. I understood why only Jewish Kafka could write such a tale and conceive of such a metaphor. Because think about so many Jews before October 7th who had it in their mind that being Jewish is fun and easy and prestigious, and it has cachet, and you're the best ally, and you're involved in social justice causes, and you have this cultural kind of prestige. We in the West, certainly in the US, Canada, have by now one, maybe even two generations of Jews who were raised in that environment. And then they wake up one day and they are genocidal baby killers. Mm-hmm. They are a giant, disgusting insect. And they don't have the muscle memory to deal with that. One of the things that I've noticed is as I was visiting campuses, as I was meeting with Jewish students, the ones who fought with the greatest sense of confidence against the rising tide of anti-Zionism on their campuses were disproportionately, not only, but disproportionately, from families that came to the US from the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, the Arab world, and Iran. Because they had the muscle memory. Their families were only one, at most two generations removed from living through that playbook. From living through the playbook of we love Jews, we have nothing against Jews, even seeing Jews at the forefront of those movements. But they know how this notion of we love Jews, it's only against Zionists. They know how it ended. They know that every society that claimed to love Jews and only hate Zionists became hostile to Jewish life, as they were claiming that they loved Jews and even had Jews at the forefront of that, and ultimately no Jews were left. So Jews who came to America from those environments, they're literally saying, we're not about to fall for that playbook once again. And it is literally a playbook. It works like this. First, you demonize and criminalize Zionism. And you do it with the Jews at the forefront. And once you do that, you charge Jews with the crime of Zionism. And no Jew, however much they try, and many do try, as I'm sure you know, will ever be able to repel the charge of Zionism. Because they just got married. And they promised not to forget Zion. And they just celebrated Passover. And they said next year in Jerusalem. My colleague, Dr. Adi Schwartz, with whom I wrote The War of Return, he wrote a beautiful piece about the wealthiest Jew in Iraq, Shafiq Adas, who was no Zionist, merely a normal Iraqi Jewish businessman, of which there were many. And he was charged with Zionism. There was no way for him to repel that because you're Jewish and you're immediately guilty. And he was hanged for that. And the Jews of Iraq got the message and got out. So they've lived through that playbook. And they're saying, you hear them, they're being interviewed. They're saying, this is now the playbook that's being kind of followed in the United States. So you don't have a story, you don't have a case where anti-Zionism rose to become law, institutionalized, and Jews thrived or stayed. Jews were gone. So this is the playbook that we're living through. Can it be fought against? This is something that people ask me over the years as I would say, look, this is the playbook, no exceptions. So people ask me, is there an exception? Was it fought against anywhere? So for many years, I used the Jeremy Corbyn case. I said, I'm sure not a lot of people remember, Jeremy Corbyn was very, very close to being British Prime Minister. People forget how close it was. And British Jews understood that if he were to be Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn is the classic third world Soviet, I'm only anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic, it's part of my anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. He genuinely believes that this is what he is. But as soon as he was the chair of the Labour Party, it became a cesspool of anti-Jewish kind of sentiment and actions. And British Jews understood that if he were to get a Downing 10, Jewish life in Britain would again come to an end. So they did something that British Jews never do, which is speak up. I'm sure you know British Jews look down upon their loud American brethren, with all their like lobbying and organizations. They're British. Someone even told me, you can even see it in how they indicate kosher food. In America, kosher food will have large kosher written on it. In Britain, you have to really look at very, very small font to see that it's kosher food. But British Jews understood that it was the time to speak. And suddenly they came out. And judges and actors and writers who nobody knew were Jewish began to speak up and to come together. And ultimately, Corbyn was defeated in a big way and nowhere close to being Prime Minister. So I used that example. And then after a few years, some British Jews told me, Einat, we're not sure we're out of the woods yet. We're not sure you can use that. Maybe we bought some time, but we're not sure it's over. So now all I'm left with, and all my hopes are riding on one viral video. Remember when these overtitled college students after October 7th took down the hostage posters, especially of the children? Remember that there were two construction workers in New York City, I think one was black and one was Hispanic, who yelled at one such student, basically, stop it, it's not right. And that video went viral. And I remember looking at that and thinking, I sincerely hope that America still has this bedrock foundation of common sense, which I'm sure you know is not so common, that will allow it to push against this tide and just say, it's not right, stop it. So the messages that I bring these days, and both of them are tough, the first is to the Jewish people, I say, this is a time to take care of our own. And it's a tough message because, again, we have by now raised 1 to 2 generations of Jews who think that being Jews is about being a great ally to everyone else, and your allies will betray you, but you'll still be a great ally. The notion that you owe a duty, a tribal duty, ooh, cringe, that you owe a duty to your people is a message that is truly tough for a lot of Jews to accept today. But that is my message. The orchestras, the museums, the universities, they'll be fine. Leave them. Now is the time, whatever passion, time, resources you have, to the Jewish people, in whichever way you see fit. That's one message I bring, because as this mass manipulation works itself through society, as I said, I have hopes riding on that viral video. But if not, by the time society kind of spirals to the bottom, to wake up and to say, oh my God, what took hold of us? What were we thinking? By the time that process happens, the Jews have often suffered the brunt of the damage. So step one is to be able to contain as much of that damage as possible. I don't think it's a coincidence that it is Syrian Jews who bought these 2 high-rises in Israel recently. Did you see that headline? That a community of Syrian Jews, 270, bought 2 high-rises, essentially bought all the apartments in 2 high-rises in Jerusalem. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence that those are Syrian Jews. So One is to take care of our own. This is also my message within Israel, that Israel needs to prepare itself both for the possibility of greater onslaughts, but also for the possibility of immigration. All of that, Israel needs to prepare itself. And the second message that I bring, true for Israel and Jews around the world, is to work with the allies that we have. Because sometimes there's a tendency to just go into general, into like everybody hates us. But no, we actually do have allies. We have people who, like those two construction workers, even if they can't exactly articulate the mass manipulation, they sense that something is wrong. They sense that what's happening is wrong and not going in a good direction. And those are the people that we need to reach out to, need to help them understand really what's at stake, and work with them, because ultimately they have the numbers and we don't. So this is my understanding of the current moment. And questions, comments?
That was good. Is any of that written down anywhere?
It's written in a variety of ways. Like the way that I work is that I write a lot of things. So there's an essay called The Palestine Propaganda Complex. A lot of the placard strategy, this notion of eradicating evil, it's pretty much there. I've written a lot on Palestinianism as the ideology of erasure and the non-existence of the Jewish state. So it's in pieces. Like this, it's something that I did more recently to tie it all together. Please.
I want to thank you for the War of Return. I think that when it came out that so many of the terrorists ended up being UNRWA workers, your book was so prophetic in that regard. My question for you is, I really agree with your hypothesis that, the concept of the right to return is prolonging the conflict. But what do you say to the fact that we Jews were also dreamers of return?
So one of the problems often in dealing with Palestinianism is that it's not only a project of erasure, it's a project of, I would say, ironically, cultural theft. So even the issue of return, what happens is, one, that it is kind of appropriated, we're like, oh, so it's like ours, so we can't deny them that. And then I have to go to explain what it is. As you read in the book, the last 150 years can be described quite simply as the political transition from multi-ethnic empires to nation states, or just states when they're less lucky. This process, as we write in the book, resulted in tens of millions of people becoming refugees, and the message to all of them was, it's tough, it's tragic, and you move on. And this was the message for Hindus and Muslims and Bulgarians and Poles and Ukrainians and Germans and Jews. And they all got the message, and even though it was a tough message, it was a message that created a world of peace. Because it basically said, these are the borders, the multi-ethnic empire is long gone, these are the new political arrangements, you move on. There's no going back. What the Arab refugees did is, after, because there was no notion of return before they became refugees, and they did not become refugees in some, act of not of their doing. They became refugees because they went to a completely stupid and moronic and unnecessary war to prevent the Jews from having anything. Because what a lot of people don't understand, I don't have a way to screen that, but I'll send you later the maps. As you see, I don't use visuals or presentations. Somewhere in the 90s, I vowed to never use PowerPoint, and I stuck to that. But I found a visual that sometimes I use because it's incredibly powerful. It's a visual, we'll send it to you, that basically shows the UN partition proposal and the incidence of malaria in the early 20th century. And it's a one-to-one map. And what you see is that basically, ultimately, after cutting Transjordan and another Arab state, what the Jewish state was designated as is the areas that the Jews reclaimed from malaria and desert. Literally, no one was displaced by Zionism. I once got some fire for tweeting that the only thing that Zionism ever displaced were mosquitoes. And you were like, you're calling. I was like, no, this is literally what I mean. So a lot of people don't realize that the UN partition proposal is an Arab victory. We don't think about it this way, but it's an Arab victory. Why? Because the UN partition proposal essentially erases and betrays the League of Nations mandate by creating another Arab state. It is a success of the Arab War in the 30s, the Great Arab Revolt, that led to the British betrayal of the mandate and to the closing of the gates to Jewish immigration at the most critical moment in Jewish history. So it's an Arab success in that there are barely any Jews left. It's there, they have a major contribution there in preventing the creation of a Jewish state when it was supposed to be created in the 30s. I always tell people the genius of Herzl is not that he imagined a Jewish state so that never again. That was not the idea. He imagined a Jewish state so that never at all. That was his genius. But it is the Arab war against Jewish sovereignty and British betrayal that essentially make the scale of the Holocaust what it is. Because imagine a situation where the Jewish state, Golda actually did go to the Evian conference in 1938. But imagine that Golda in 1938 would have been the foreign minister of a sovereign Jewish state and would be able to say, we want the Jews, we want them. The whole scale of the Holocaust would have been different. I say that the only difference between Europe in the 30s and the Arab world in the 50s is the existence of a Jewish state. The Arab world ended up being only a situation of ethnic cleansing because the Jews had somewhere to go. So, sorry, I went through the train of thought. Okay, so it's a great Arab victory, right? There's barely any Jews left for a Jewish state. The Jewish state that the UN proposes is a rump state of the areas eradicated from malaria plus desert. It's another Arab state. The Arabs could have definitely said, excellent, great victory, we're good to go. But no, it was so much more important for them that the Jews have nothing than to actually enjoy their achievements, that they went to a stupid, unnecessary, moronic war. When people tell me, even to the present in Gaza, what do you expect? What option did they have? I'm like, the option of saying yes was always there. Somehow it's like this magical unknown. So they could have said yes to another Arab state. They went to a stupid war. They become refugees. Except for the fact that the war was unnecessary, nothing special about becoming refugees in war. And then they create and organize themselves around the concept of return, not as an innocent idea, and in the book we show it. They organized it as a political idea that was designed for one purpose only, which is the undoing of the Jewish state. In the book we also bring examples where individual Arabs could have exercised individual return, but they were not interested in that because it didn't serve the political goal of ending the Jewish state. So when Jews speak of return, it was always in the service of establishing a Jewish sovereign state. Just living in the land of Israel, Jews could always do. But the idea was that this is Jewish sovereignty. If the Arab conception of return were like the Jewish one that is at the service of self-determination, independence, a positive goal, First of all, there would have never been a need for displacement and return because they would have said yes in the 30s and the 40s to living next to a Jewish state. But the Arab idea of return was always in the service of the erasure of the Jewish state. So the difference is precisely the difference in goals. Zionism is a movement of self-determination, liberation, statehood. How do you know, by the way, that Zionism is an entirely normal movement of self-determination? I mean, normal insofar as anything Jewish is ever normal, but it's a normal movement in the sense that if you look in the last 150 years at this transformation of multi-ethnic empires to nation states, I looked into it to see, is there an example of a people who have a movement for self-determination, they claim that they want self-determination, independence, statehood, get multiple opportunities to achieve good enough. I can assure you, no nation state in the world sits on all the land that it believes it has a historical claim to. Nothing special about that. But all countries, all liberation movements ultimately accept a good enough situation. So do you have an example of a movement that claims to want self-determination, gets multiple opportunities to get good enough, rejects every single one, and never has any internal debate, civil war about that decision? There are none, except the Palestinians. So you can say it's a fluke, they're just incredibly special, or you can use it as one more data point that fits all the other data points, that Palestinianism, and within the idea of return, is not a movement for a positive goal, for self-determination, liberation, statehood, independence. It is an ideological movement organized around the idea of negation and destruction. That it is more important for the Jews to have nothing than to the Arabs have something. If you read the book, which you did, then you know I used a quote by Ernst Bevin, and someone recently gave me another quote by Bobby Kennedy, which I'm sure you know was very supportive of Zionism, and probably the reason for his assassination. And Bobby Kennedy in April 1948, so Bevin says this in February 47, the Jews want to establish a sovereign Jewish state. And again, this is how you know that Zionism is a normal liberation movement. We get the lands we reclaim from malaria, desert, and we go and dance hora. This is what normal liberation movements do. They take what they can get as long as they can have independence and statehood. Bobby Kennedy in April 1948, it's just a week ago that someone sent me this quote, said, for the Jews, the key thing is to have a homeland. And for the Arabs, he says, it is against law and against nature for the Jews to have a state. So another person observing the same dynamic at about the same time, and again, they did not invent it, they just listened to the sides and they realized what the priorities are. So the Arab conception of return has nothing to do with the Jewish one, except for the purpose of erasure and pretending that it's this innocent notion. How can the Jews have it and the Arabs not have it? I'm like, the Jews had the right to self-determination, not to return to every square inch that was ever mentioned in the historic Jewish homeland. The Jews as a people were recognized as having the right to self-determination, which they exercised. Once they became a sovereign state, they did what every sovereign state does, which is the very essence of sovereignty, define a law of immigration and naturalization, which privileges, in the case of Israel, Jews, but every country privileges someone. And on the Arab side, essentially, they were offered that multiple times. You can have your own state, and Palestinians around the world can live in that state, and you can have a law of immigration and naturalization which will privilege people who identify as Palestinians. And they always rejected that because their conception of return was always in the service of the destruction of the Jewish state, never some innocent idea. So it's not that they are dreamers in this innocent notion. It is a political idea designed to continue the war against the Jewish state by more means. Yes, please.
Folks, just real quick, we have about, 10 minutes, so we'll just so we understand. If we, of course, if that doesn't run right off, we can stick around and maybe ask questions when we conclude, but for those of you who need to check in, that will be your time.
Okay. Yes.
I want to say I am struggling a little bit, not with the facts of what you're saying, but with the way in which both listening to your book and hearing what you're saying now makes me feel perhaps a lack of empathy towards the Palestinians, and a feeling of despair as well. Like that. Well, then, how do we do this? Will we ever have two states? And like, what parts of it are the fault of Israel? And I want to just think about those things.
Okay. So the empathy that I have is for the tragedy that this ideology is for all involved. So the empathy is that given that they organize themselves around an ideology of destruction and negation, it has brought destruction and war on them as well as us. And this is the empathy, and I want to expand even this notion, because one of the things that I've discovered over the years is that there is a vast difference between feeling good and doing good. If you're a parent, you know that. And it's true for many fields. What I've discovered over the years is a lot of people who claim to want to do good, they just really want to feel good. Because doing good often requires doing things that don't feel good. So for example, apropos empathy, a few months ago I was in Paris for a conference on making peace. This is a few months ago, after October 7th. I go in and they're like, what about the two-state solution? You need to go back to the negotiating table. When are you going back to the negotiating table? As if nothing had happened. And then the European moderator, she turns to me and she says, how can we in Europe help? And I don't know your experience, but my experience is that often when Europeans ask that, they ask it with the smug tone of how can we, peace-loving, enlightened Europeans, help you savages solve your problems. And I turned to her and I said, you know what would really be nice? What would really be nice is if you remembered why you are enjoying decades of peace. Because it's not because you are enlightened and peace-loving. You are no such thing. You are enjoying decades of peace because some ruthless leaders with a zero empathy, but ruthless leaders of the Allies understood that World War II, unlike World War I, will not end with a wishy-washy armistice. The losers will know that they lost, and everyone who helped them, except the Italians that are very good at switching at the last minute. The losers will know that they lost, and they will pay in land, in displacement, in reparations, in being occupied, dismembered, denazified, re-educated. All of this is not what we think of as empathy, but those are exactly the things that created a better world. And this is what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that for Jews and Arabs to finally live the ideology of Palestinianism that has brought so much destruction has to die. I would argue that I'm doing and speaking as harshly as I do precisely because I want something good to happen. And I know that all the people who are like just about understand each other and feel good, all those things have done no good. And now we need some ruthless leaders who will speak the truth and will take the actions that will remove, that will close down UNRWA as the central fueling station of Palestinianism, that will end the scam of perpetual refugeehood, that will kill the idea of return, which again is not an innocent idea. I'm using harsh words on purpose because those harsh words and ultimately harsh actions are the only ones that can actually get us to a better reality. And that's the thing that I sometimes feel that we need to bring back because so many people have been living through 8 decades of world peace, they've come to think that this is the natural condition of humans, rather than knowing how much effort, how much kind of determination went into creating that world, and that it did not come from being enlightenment and peace-loving and just recognizing the humanity of the other. So this is why I insist on it. And my argument in terms of how we move from there, that is exactly how we move. The whole idea of a two-state solution was never an Arab idea. It was always a Jewish idea. So when people ask me about it now, especially, for example, as I'm campaigning, and one of the key messages of my party, Oz, if you want to go look, it's ozparty.co.il, the first message is pursue peace based on Arab and Palestinian embrace of Zionism. And it talks about the need to end Palestinianism as an ideology for there to be peace. And then people tell me, so what, a Palestinian state? I'm like, you know what? I'm done thinking what they should want. The ideology of our destruction has to die, the ideology, not the people. And when they can become a people who express a positive vision for themselves, whatever it is, I have no doubt they will play ball. And the reason that I have no doubt is people tell me, oh, Bibi, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, you know, whenever Netanyahu, despite the fact that he said yes to Palestinian state multiple times, whenever he goes and says, I prevented a Palestinian state, I always go and tweet that it's really not nice to take credit for the one achievement of the Palestinian national movement. Because he didn't prevent anything. They never tried to achieve a state if it has to live next to a Jewish state. So I'm saying I'm done thinking what they should want. They should express it, and we, as I said, for the last century, the Jews have always agreed to every two-state solution, provided one of the two is the Jewish state, and the Palestine Arabs have rejected every two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. So once they become a people capable of uttering a positive vision, I have no doubt, again, except for our red line of having a Jewish state somewhere in the land of Israel, other than that one insistence, we won't be the problem of reaching any kind of political arrangement.
Folks,
Do we have time?
We're gonna have to put our hands down.
Sorry, my answers are long.
And then, as I mentioned though, as we're making our way, those checking in, those who need the restrooms and so on, enough time to run out, and we can walk and talk